As you know, my father, my mother, my grandparents fled communism. It wasn't Cuba, it was Croatia, Eastern Europe. And just like this man, they came to the New World, searching for a better life, for freedom, for liberty, for opportunity, to breathe the air, the clean air of freedom. He fled communist Cuba as a young man. He came to this country with nothing, just like my father, just like my mother, except he had one thing, the will. A will to succeed, a desire to work hard, to pull himself up by the bootstraps, love this country, love its constitution, love its history, and love its freedom. And he created a beautiful life and a successful life for his son, for his family, and for himself. And now, if you want to see how great this country is, this man, this refugee of communism, of tyranny, his son is now not only a US Senator from the great state of Texas, but he is literally one of the most influential, prominent senators we have in the country today. And God willing, the next president of the United States. This man is the embodiment of the American dream. To me, he is the symbol of everything I stand for, what our show stands for, what Kuhner country stands for. So please, everybody, give Pastor Rafael Cruz a warm Massachusetts welcome. Thank you. Please be seated. Please have a seat. Well, I want to start by telling you about a brand new, very exhaustive research study that was done by a very prestigious university in the United States. And they came to the conclusion that Barack Obama was the 5th best president of the United States. The 5th best president in the United States. And these were the results of the study. Washington, Lincoln, and Reagan were tied for number 1. There were 16 presidents tied for number 2. 23 presidents tied for number 3. Jimmy Carter was number 4. And Barack Obama was number 5. And actually, before I start, we heard from all these wonderful candidates. And I'll tell you, Massachusetts is not off limit to turning red. So I want to say something on behalf of Jeff and all the other candidates that are here. And I want to quote the words of a great senator from the state of Texas, Senator Phil Graham. And Senator Phil Graham used to say, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is all these candidates have all the money they need for their campaigns. The bad news is still in your pocket, so write a check. Anyway, it is so great to be in this beautiful state of Massachusetts. And I'm really encouraged when I see all these strong conservative Republicans running for office. And I was very encouraged when Jeff told me that in the last couple of elections you double the number of state reps that are Republican. Well, all we have to do is double them a couple more times and you'll have a majority. So the trend is in the right direction. Anyway, I'm so pleased to be here. As Jeff was saying, I was born in Cuba. Grew up under strong military dictatorship, very oppressive, a lot of corruption. And the revolution started in the high schools and the universities. So I found myself involved in a revolution as a teenager. I remember during that time, a young charismatic leader rose up, talking about hope and change. His name was Fidel Castro. And we all followed him. We thought he was going to be our liberator. Little did we know. Well, as a result of my involvement in the revolution, I was captured, I was imprisoned, I was tortured, but by the grace of God, I was released, and I had no choice but to leave Cuba. I was being followed. I couldn't put my parents in peril. So the easiest way to leave the country was with a student visa. I wrote to 3 universities in the United States. The first university to accept me was the University of Texas. So with my acceptance letter from the University of Texas, I went to the U.S. consulate, got a 4-year student visa, and came to the United States legally on a 4-year student visa. Went to school full-time, worked full-time, and then about a year and 3 months later, on January of 1959, Castro took over. So that June, I went back to Cuba, and I got the shock of my life. That same man that had been talking about hope and change was now talking about how the rich were evil, about how they oppressed the poor, and about the need to redistribute the wealth. He began confiscating private property, began attacking freedom of the press, began shutting down newspapers, radio stations, television stations, began attacking the church. Then he began attacking the educational system. My mother was a school teacher. And they put out an edict to all public schools that they had to teach Marxism in the public schools. I am so very proud of what my mother did when that edict came to that school. My mother was a 6th grade teacher. She faked an attack of insanity in her class. In front of all the students, she was running up and down, foaming at the mouth, pulling her hair out, just acting like a crazy nut. And so she was able to be dismissed by reason of insanity. Her statement was, I would rather make a fool of myself in front of everyone than poison the minds of children with communist indoctrination. So anyway, I came back from Cuba, back to the States, never to return again. But so grateful to be in the greatest country on the face of the earth. I'm so proud to be an American. This is, without a doubt, the greatest country on the face of the earth. And I just decided that I will make the best of it. You know, it is so sad to hear our president trying to convince us that this is not an exceptional country. But this is absolutely an exceptional country. You know, Horatio Alger's stories are a dime a dozen in this country. Anyone with hard work and perseverance can achieve any dream they have. I remember there's a scripture in the book of Proverbs that has served me well for many, many years. And it says, though the righteous falls 7 times, he gets up again. Now, all of us are going to stumble and fall, but when we fall, we have 2 choices. We either can stay down there feeling sorry for ourselves, or we can get up with twice the determination. If we do that, there's nothing that can stop us. So it's all right if you ran and wasn't successful, just try it again. Remember what Winston Churchill said? Never, 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 never give up. So I even had people that said, well, you're a foreigner. You're going to be discriminated against. And I said, well, that doesn't bother me at all. All I have to do, if I'm competing with somebody else for a job, I have to be twice as good as the other person, so there's no choice. The choice is obvious. It's also served me well. Anyway, I came back to the States. graduated from college, went on to start an oil and gas exploration company. And then in the late 70s, I was shocked again. Do any of you remember the Carter years? 22% interest rates, double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, lines around the block to get gasoline, a government so weak in foreign policy that Iran had become so emboldened that they captured 52 Americans and held them hostage for 444 days. You know, I am so proud of my son that just 2 weeks ago, he was able to pass a bill by unanimous decision in the House and in the Senate, making it against the law for a known terrorist to come to the United States as an ambassador. And I am sure that reluctantly, but President Obama had no choice but to sign that bill, because he would have been embarrassed if he had gone back. It would have been, if he had vetoed it, it would have been overridden because it passed by unanimous decision. Iran had appointed one of those 52 terrorists to come to the United Nations as UN ambassador. And that means to come to New York City with diplomatic immunity. God help us. But you know something? It is not coincidental that those 52 hostages were released the day President Reagan was inaugurated, on the 20th of January, 1981. Now let me tell you the class of President Reagan. You know who President Reagan appointed to welcome the hostages? Jimmy Carter. That is poetic justice, really. But anyway, I remember, because of Jimmy Carter, I became very heavily involved in Republican politics. I joined an organization called the Religious Roundtable. It was a Judeo-Christian organization, which together with Moral Majority, we mobilized millions of Christians across America to help elect whom I consider the greatest president in the last 150 years, Ronald Reagan, to the White House. And so when my son Ted was 9 years old, he got a dose of it, because every day at the dinner table, all we talked about was why we had to get rid of this leftist Marxist and replace him with a constitutional conservative. And I remember during that time, I must have asked him a dozen times, you know, Ted, when I lost my freedom in Cuba, I had a place to come to. If we lose our freedoms here, where are we going to go? There is no place to go. And that is a very relevant question that each and every one of us needs to ask. Now, quite often I come across people that tell me, oh, we could never lose our freedoms here. We are losing our freedoms here. The difference is this. In Cuba, we lost them overnight. I have a fellow Cuban here, sitting over there. Anyway, we lost our freedoms overnight. Here is happening a little bit at a time. And we keep taking it. Most of us have become complacent. It's like the old story of the frog. You throw a frog in a pot of hot water, that frog is going to jump right out. But you put a frog in a pot of cold water and put it on the stove, and that water is warming up a little at a time, and that frog is comfortable. That frog is complacent, and you can boil that frog to death. And we are being boiled to death just like that frog because of our complacency. It is about time we draw a line in the sand. But anyway, you know, the Bible says that our steps are ordered of the Lord. There's nothing casual on this earth. Everything is causal. You have to move the U. Instead of casual, it's causal. God has a plan for everything. As my son Ted was entering high school, through a client of mine, I was able to introduce Ted to a man by the name of Roland Story. Roland Story was the president of an organization called the Free Enterprise Institute. So now my son is just entering high school. He's reading Milton Friedman. He's reading Adam Smith. He's reading von Mises. He's reading Hayek. He's reading Frederick Bastiat. He's reading the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And then the Free Enterprise Institute picks 5 kids, of which Ted was one of them, calls them the constitutional corroborators. What a name. The constitutional corroborators. And then using what is called a mnemonic device, where these kids would memorize a string of letters, and from that they would recreate the text. These 5 kids memorized the entire U.S. Constitution. For the next 4 years, these 5 kids would go into Rotary clubs all over the state of Texas. Rotary clubs met for lunch. They would put 5 easels in the front of the room, and while people were having lunch, these 5 kids would write the Constitution by memory on those easels. And then they would give a half-hour patriotic speech on free market economics and the Constitution. During the next 4 years, my son gave approximately 80 speeches, about 20 per year for 4 years, on free market economics in the Constitution. Before Ted left high school, he was passionate about the Constitution. He was passionate about the Declaration. He was passionate about free markets and limited government and the rule of law. And that passion became like fire in his bones. And let me tell you, that fire is as alive today as it was over 30 years ago in my son Ted. That's why I know he's not going to compromise in Washington. Because that fire didn't start today. It started over 3 decades ago. But you know, during all that time, both he and I fell in love with the Constitution. You know, we got to realize there's a lot about our history that is being erased from the history books. We have such a tremendous heritage in this country. As a matter of fact, when the Pilgrims came from England, they came for one purpose. They wanted the freedom to worship God. They got to America, not too far from here. And when they arrived, they decided to try a communist experiment. Basically, they said, look, we have all this land before us. Let us all work the land together, and we will share in what the land produces. They almost starved to death. But they were smart enough and flexible enough that they went back to Governor Bradford and they said, this didn't work. So Governor Bradford said, all right, each of you get your own piece of land, you work the land, you feed your family, and the free enterprise system was born in America the second year they were here. Now my question is this: if we tried that experiment over 4 centuries ago and it failed, will we be so dumb enough to try it again? Doesn't make any sense, does it? George Santayana once said, if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we're doomed to repeat them. Anyway, there is so much that happened during these early years of the revolution. And there's so much that most Americans don't have a clue. Did you know that every grievance in the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence is a series of grievances against King George. Do you know that each and every one of those grievances were preached from the pulpits of America before they were written in the Declaration? It was pastors that started the revolution in the United States. They were the real forefathers of the revolution long before the framers. Pastors like George Whitefield and many others. They were from the pulpit calling out King George for the atrocities that he was perpetrating upon the American people. Now the question is, where are those pastors today? You know where most of them are? Hiding behind their pulpits. Hiding behind their pulpits. God help us. As a matter of fact, you hear, I do pastors' conferences all over the country. In the last 12 months, I've done 24 pastors' conferences all over the United States. And I get a series of excuses from pastors. One is, separation of church and state. Listen, I know the Constitution very well. I know the Declaration very well. Separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration. When this country was being started as a representative constitutional republic, all 13 colonies were concerned that this new government was not going to impose a state religion like they fled from in England. All 13 colonies had the same concern. But the Danbury Baptists expressed that concern to Thomas Jefferson, and so Thomas Jefferson writes him a letter. And first of all, he says in that letter, in matters of faith and religion, no one has the right to interfere. That is between you and God, period. Very clear. Then he cites the First Amendment of the Constitution. And he says that legislature shall not do anything to impose a state religion or to try to be involved in the free exercise thereof, citing the First Amendment. And then he says, thus, there is a wall of separation between church and state. If you look at the letter to the Danbury Baptists, it is absolutely clear that Thomas Jefferson was talking about a one-way wall. A one-way wall to keep government from interfering with religion or from establishing a state religion. In no way, shape, or form was telling the church not to be involved in society. As a matter of fact, we ought to be an influence in every area of society. As the Church of Jesus Christ, we should be influencing arts and entertainment, sports, the media, boy, that's one group that needs it, education, business, government. Every area. But I'll tell you, you need to be able to decode the rhetoric. For example, have you heard people in this administration talking about freedom of worship? You heard the term? They don't talk about freedom of religion. They are trying to change the phrase to freedom of worship. Let me tell you what comes after that. What comes after that is what you have in Cuba today. You have freedom of worship in Cuba. Freedom of worship means you can worship inside a house of worship. That means it's confined within the four walls of the church. In Cuba, there are sanctioned churches where people can go and they can evangelize inside the church. They can preach. There are spies there to monitor everything that's said, but it is against the law to evangelize outside the four walls of the church. That's where the Obama administration is going, promoting this freedom of worship. Not freedom of religion, freedom of worship. To eradicate religion outside the four walls of the church. To eliminate all the influence of religion upon society. But you know, the Bible says in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 15, it says, he that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the righteous, both of them are an abomination to the Lord. He that condemns, he that justifies the wicked, or he that condemns the righteous. Now let me ask you a question. If you are silent, are you not justifying the wicked? Silence is not an option. Edmund Burke once said, all that has to happen for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. Passivity is not a solution. All of those people that didn't vote in the last election, they voted for Obama by not voting. There is another excuse that I get. Oh, God just called me to preach the gospel. Sounds very pious, doesn't it? My question to those pastors is, define the gospel. What is the gospel? Because the gospel is a lot more than John 3:16. You know, the Apostle Paul said, my hands are free from the blood of all men because I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. That's from cover to cover. And let me tell you, the Bible talks a lot about politics. As a matter of fact, did you know that the Bible tells you exactly who to vote for? Very, very clearly the Bible tells you who to vote for. Let me prove it to you. Let me put it in context. Moses has just crossed the Red Sea. And now Moses is in the wilderness trying to govern 1 million people. And Moses is going bananas. And here comes his father-in-law, Jethro. And God speaks through Jethro. And Jethro says, Moses, what you're doing is not good. And in Exodus chapter 18, verse 21, Jethro says to Moses, you select from among the people. Now that's the same as you elect from among the people. And now he gives 4 qualifications. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. I'm going to repeat it. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Now let's define those terms. Able men. That means elect somebody who is capable of doing the job. Don't elect the village idiot. And by the way, when I'm talking about men, I'm talking about men and women. Number 2, such as fear God. Now that requires some explanation. What does it mean to fear God? Well, if you fear God, you obey God's precepts. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, you live by a moral code. For example, you defend the sanctity of life. But beyond the moral code, that means you live a life of integrity, honesty, hard work, individual responsibility, the rule of law, and yes, free enterprise and limited government. And the Bible has a lot to say about all those. So able men, such as fear God. Number 3, men of truth. Now, haven't we had enough men and women of lies in government? I mean, this administration will tell you one lie to cover up the previous lie. And whether it is Lois Lerner, or is Ron Emanuel, or is our illustrious Attorney General, or is our President, they go from lie to lie to lie to lie. It is about time that we have men and women of truth running for office, men and women of truth in public office. Now let me ask you a question. Haven't you had candidates that will tell you all kinds of things in their campaign, and when they get in office, they do exactly the opposite? You know, it is about time that we stop listening to their rhetoric and we start looking at their record. Most of these politicians have a record. Jesus said, ye shall know them by their fruit. Stop listening to their rhetoric. Look at their record. Doesn't do you any good to listen to a politician that tells you, oh yes, I'm pro-life, and they've voted for abortion 17 times. Don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth. Number 4, hating covetousness. Now let me tell you something about covetousness in government. Covetousness in government is not so much about money as it is about power and control. These politicians covet power, and they covet the control that power gives them. That's why we have politicians in Washington that have been there for 30 and 40 years, and they want to be there another 20, because they covet that power. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. And then it continues, and it says, and appoint them as rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. So here is the hierarchy. Moses, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. That's equivalent to federal government, state government, county government, local government. Verse 22. And only take matters of great importance up to Moses. Everything else you handle yourself. In other words, at the local level. That is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment. The essence of federalism in 2 verses of Scripture. Article 1, Section 8, the 9th Amendment, the 10th Amendment. Article 1, Section 8 is called the enumerated powers of Congress. 18 powers enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. If it's not there, the federal government's got no business being involved in it. Let me give you a couple of examples of things that are not in Article 1, Section 8. Education. You don't find that anywhere in Article 1, Section 8. And isn't it absurd that a bunch of unelected bureaucrats in Washington will tell us how to educate our children and grandchildren? That decision needs to be with the local school board, with parents, and with teachers. If you follow Article 1, Section 8, the Department of Education is unconstitutional. The best thing we could do with it is abolish it, get rid of it. Let me tell you another word that is not in Article 1, Section 8. Environment. And I'll tell you what, if there is a single agency of the federal government that is most responsible for the economic malaise that we have in this country, that is doing more to destroy our country, destroy our economy, is the EPA. It's not in Article 1, Section 8. You draw the conclusion. So, let's go back to the Constitution. You know, it is not coincidental that the very first 3 words in the Constitution are "we the people." We the people. You see, when the framers designed this great American experiment, they did something that had never ever been done in the world. All other governments around the world were top-down governments, were ruled by a tyrant or a monarch. And the people were serfs of that government under total control of that government. The framers turned that system right side up, and it became a bottom-up system where we the people are the ones who govern. I'll tell you what, it's about time that we send a loud message to our politicians in Washington and our politicians in the state houses that they work for us, we don't work for them. Let me me tell you, before I get onto the declaration, let me share a couple of more things with you about our history, which is not in the textbooks anymore. Do you know where Paul Revere was going when he was shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming"? He was going to the home of a pastor by the name of Jonas Clark. At the home of Jonas Clark were two other patriots, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Pastor Jonas Clark was one of many pastors, probably the most feared men by the British Army. They called them the Black Robe Regiment. These pastors wore long black robes. Many of them had the Continental Army uniform underneath the black robe. They would preach on Sunday and then take off that robe and with half their congregation go fight for our independence. Now my question again, where are those pastors today? I know we have a couple of exceptions here, like here in this room, but most of those pastors are hiding behind their pulpit. As a matter of fact, the very first battle for our independence was the Battle of Lexington. Do you know who led the Battle of Lexington? Pastor Jonas Clark. You know who were his troops? The men from his congregation. That's our history. That's our heritage. To all those pastors that say, I don't want to get involved in politics. Let me tell you, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 29 of them, over half of them, were seminary graduates. They were preachers. They were theologians. They were men of God. But you know, you get this statement. Again, I hear it quite often. Politics is a dirty business. I don't want any part of it. And they wash their hands like Pontius Pilate. You know, Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, people mourn. Now, if the righteous are not running for office, if the righteous are not even voting, what does that leave? That leaves the wicked electing the wicked. We get what we deserve. As a matter of fact, let me give you a statistic. That is the reason why I'm doing all these pastors' conferences. Unfortunately, I only have the number for evangelical Christians. I don't have the numbers for Catholics, but I've talked to a Catholic bishop not too long ago. He told me the numbers are the same. The statistic that I heard for evangelical Christians was that in the United States there were approximately 65 million evangelical Christians. And that only 50% of those are registered to vote. And of the 50% that were registered to vote, only 50% voted in the last election. That means 75% of Christians stayed at home, didn't even vote. And the numbers are the same in the Catholic Church. We get what we deserve when we stay at home and we do not exercise our civic responsibility. But let me tell you the flip side. If the people of God would get involved, you just look at the numbers. As I said, I don't have the numbers for the Catholic Church, but among evangelical Christians, 50% and then 25%, we're talking about 48 million evangelical Christians sitting at home. Suppose we got 5% of those to vote, and to vote according to biblical principles. We could turn Massachusetts red in one election. We could turn every state in the union red in one election. But it takes the people of God, the people of principle, to become part of the solution instead of whining and complaining. Let me tell you, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. But it's not just voting. It's voting according to principles that you uphold. Principles should go above party. Let's stop being politically correct and let's start being biblically correct. Anyway, I want to finish by talking a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. And in the second paragraph of the preamble, it begins by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The problem is, to those clowns in Washington, they are not very self-evident. It continues by saying that all men are created equal. Again, the problem with Washington is that some are more equal than others. We saw it with the bailouts that were just giving handouts to pay off political favors. Or we saw it with Solyndra, we saw it with General Motors, we saw it with General Electric. The biggest example of that is Obamacare. Here is a law that nobody wanted, that Nancy Pelosi said we have to pass it before we read it. Now they read it, now they're shocked, now they don't like it. But anyway, that Congress who passed the law, they want an exception. That the IRS, who are the enforcers of the law, they want an exception. That big business who finances this administration, they want an exception. That the labor unions who provide the foot soldiers for the campaigns of this administration, they want an exception. Well, what about we the people? What about we the people? You know, that's what that 22-hour filibuster of my son was all about. It was about fighting for the right of people. And you know, you read it probably 2,000 times. Ted Cruz shut down the government. That's not true. Harry Reid and Barack Obama shut down the government. You also hear, Ted Cruz really had done a lot of harm to the party. No, Ted Cruz brought Obamacare to the limelight and put it as a concern for the whole population. And as a result of that, the whole, as was said a little while ago, I think it was by Vic, the Democratic Party is scared to death. Or maybe it was you. The Democratic Party is scared to death. Let me tell you, the biggest blessings that the conservatives have received is Obamacare. Obamacare is the gift that keeps on giving. It is a nightmare of such proportions that is going to be the debacle and, you know, the demise of the Democrats. And they are dumb enough that they're doubling down on Obamacare. And we are going to see unprecedented wins in 2014. Across the board, not only federally, but in every state legislature, we're going to see wins left and right. People are fed up. I see a young man, 10 years old over there. Unfortunately, I don't see too many other young kids here. But I will address this young man. And let me tell you something. Tell me your name one more time.
Colin.
Colin, let me say something, Colin. I'm going to say something very serious. If we lose this fight, you will not have a future. That's how serious this fight is. I want each and every one of you to hear me. If we lose this fight, our children and our grandchildren will not have a future. Now, with that ominous statement, can you afford to continue sitting down on your rear end? No, we have to take this country back. And we can. And we can. Remember Proverbs 29:2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, people mourn. There has been a lot of mourning in America in the last 5 years. But there's another verse of scripture that gives me a lot of courage. And that's Psalms 30, verse 5. And it says, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And let me tell you, morning is coming to America. morning is coming to America. Let me tell you something, just with the men and women in this room. If each one of us takes their marching orders and say, I will do everything to turn this country around, just the men and women in this room can turn Massachusetts red. It doesn't take much. But let's continue with the declaration. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed, and what are the next three words? By their Creator. Words that this administration would love to erase. Would love to erase because they want you to believe that those rights come from government. But it doesn't say they come from government. It says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. The only thing that makes those rights unalienable is if they come from God. Because if they come from government, government can take them away. And they're trying very hard to do that. And then the Declaration lists those three rights in order of importance. And obviously the most important of them is life. Because if you're dead, you can't enjoy liberty and you can't pursue happiness. You're dead. So life is the most important. Life is under attack as never before. From the cradle to the grave. Since 1973, 55 million babies have been murdered by abortion in this country. And at the end of life, you look at Obamacare. If there's one group of people that Obamacare hits very hard, it's the elderly. Look around the world. In most countries of the world that have socialized medicine, a medical procedure for the elderly has a waiting period of 12 to 18 months. A couple of months ago, I was speaking at a Tea Party meeting in Texas. There were maybe 200-300 people there. And a man from Yugoslavia was telling a story, and he had come from Yugoslavia when he was a child with his parents. And now his mother had died, and his father said, look, I'm going back to Yugoslavia. All my family is in Yugoslavia. So he moved back to Yugoslavia. 2 months later, he was not feeling very well, went to the doctor, and the doctor said, you have prostate cancer. And they scheduled his operation for 20 months into the future. Next day, he called American Airlines and flew back to the States and said, forget Yugoslavia. Within a week, he had his operation. That is what Obamacare will do for you. And let me tell you something else, and this is great news for us. Because of Obamacare, there has been a very substantial shift among the young people towards conservatism. Very significant, because all of a sudden they are realizing they are the patsies for Obamacare. They are the ones that are going to have to foot the bill for the health care of people my age. And they don't like it. They thought it was going to be free. It ain't free. As a matter of fact, they're the ones who have to foot the bill to make Obamacare be able to work. So we are even going to make great inroads with the youth. And let me tell you how to reach the youth. What do you see the youth doing all the time? Tweeting, sending texts on their phone all the time, Facebook, email. Talk to the youth about the NSA. Talk to the youth about how the NSA is reading all their texts and all their emails and listening to all their phone conversations to their buddies and their girlfriends and boyfriends and reading their emails. And I'll tell you, you'll get their attention. That's a winning issue for the youth. That's probably one that really resonates with them. But let's continue with the declaration. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with it by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life. And before I get off life, Let me turn to the Second Amendment. And let me share something with you. Did you know that we do not get our rights to keep and bear arms from the Second Amendment? We don't get our rights to keep and bear arms from the Second Amendment. Let's see what it says. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed upon. The Second Amendment assumes you already have that right. Because you see, the right to keep and bear arms. The right to keep and bear arms is immersed in that right to life. If you have a right to life, you have the right to defend your life and defend the life of your loved ones. That's what's at the core of this fight for the Second Amendment. Of course, you know about the new idea of Eric Holder. He calls it smart guns. A gun that only you can fire. You have to have a bracelet that sends a signal, listen carefully, by GPS to your gun. And if you don't have that bracelet and you don't send that signal to that by GPS to that gun, the gun won't fire. Now the fact that the signal is by GPS, what else do you think the GPS does? Tells the government who has all the guns and where they are. You know what the next step is? Confiscation. Now, again, look at history. Remember the lessons of history. If we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. Stalin took away the guns. Then he killed 20 million people. Mao took away the guns. Then he killed 50 million people. And the same thing with Pol Pot and with WRKO. As a matter of fact, even in my country, in Cuba, you read the history of Cuba. In Cuba, there were 2 wars of independence against Spain. The first war lasted 10 years. At the end of that 10-year war, what do you think that the Spanish government did? Confiscated all the guns. So when they went to the second war in 1895, they had no guns. So they used machetes, which is what they used to cut sugarcane. And they fought the war just like in the old ancient times with swords, except instead of swords, they had machetes. And they would go with machetes running as fast as they could in horses, cutting heads off and confiscating the muskets from the Spaniards. Every tyrant has taken the guns away and then used them against the people. But, I mean, even if you don't look at that, it's the most stupid idea you ever heard of. Suppose you're taking a shower and you took that bracelet off and an intruder walks into your house. And you jump out of the shower naked, grab your gun, and your gun will fire. Or you're very, very self-conscious. You take a shower with your bracelet on. And you're taking your shower with your bracelet on, and that intruder comes in, and your wife grabs the gun, and the gun won't fire. It's the dumbest idea in the world. But I'll tell you who's going to love it. All the people that are selling guns. I'll tell you what, if you think we have mountains of people in the gun shows, they're going to multiply 10 times over. Because nobody's going to want one of those guns. Conventional guns are going to cost twice as much because everybody's going to want to buy 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll tell you what, probably without exception, everybody here is going to say, nobody's going to take my Bible or my gun.
Amen.
So, the next most important right is liberty. Because if you don't have liberty, you're a slave. And if you're a slave, you cannot pursue happiness. The next statement says, governments are instituted to preserve these rights, not to trample upon these rights like it's happening on a daily basis, by an administration totally out of control, by a president that tells you, I got a pen and I got a phone, by a president that is governing by executive order, by fiat, by decree, no different than that bearded dictator I left behind in Cuba. The next sentence, it says, government derives its just powers by the consent of the governed. Who are the governed? Here, I want to hear. Who are the governed? All right. Let me ask you something. Did any of you give the Obama administration your consent for them to cram Obamacare down our throats? No. Did we give the NSA the consent to listen to our phone conversations, and look at our emails, and look at our texts? No. Did we give the IRS the consent to go after pro-life organizations, Tea Party organizations, pro-liberty organizations, pro-Israel organizations? No. Well, it is about time that we demand that we, the people, be heard. But there's one more sentence after that. It says, when government ceases to work towards those ends, it is our right, and I believe it is our duty, to remove that government and replace it with another government. And we have an unprecedented opportunity to do that this November. But it's going to take each and every one of us to become part of the solution. You know, we're great at doing this. You get involved. You know, every time you do that, there's 3 fingers pointing at you. We can't pass the buck anymore. I want to finish with the last few words of the Declaration, where it says, relying upon the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We've already seen how they have attacked our lives from the cradle to the grave. And in between, our life, our freedom of life, is being erased more and more by taxation and by regulation. Our fortunes, the Obama administration has both hands in your pockets, trying to take every hard-earned dollar you make and give it out in handouts to buy votes. But I'll tell you something. They can take our lives. They can take our fortunes, but no one can take our honor. No one can take our honor. I want us to stand, please. I want us to stand, and I want us to do something. I want us to make a covenant to one another before God. I want to repeat this covenant that these framers did. And I want you to repeat it after me from the heart. I want you to stand in pairs facing one another, and if there's a straggler, just make a pair of 3. You get into this thing too. Come on. Okay. All right. You can do it by yourself, right? All right. I'm going to repeat it. I want to hear you in a loud voice from the heart, relying upon the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to each other. Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, to do all we can, to restore righteousness to America. To do all we can, to restore free enterprise, the rule of law, and limited government.